The most interesting part, right, is that idea of, well, what is a dysfunction? Because in an agile world, I can speak fairly confidently about what dysfunction is, because if you say you're a Scrum team but you're breaking the rules of Scrum, okay, that's probably dysfunctional. If you are not creating psychological safety, or you're not following XP practices, ignoring TDD, these are things that we can fairly confidently say could, if not definitely, represent dysfunction.
Right. Hi, everyone. We're back for another episode with Andre and Michael Lloyd, the creator of Dysfunction Mapping. Now, for our viewers, Michael, could you please give a short introduction to who you are and how Dysfunction Mapping, how you developed it?
Yeah, sure thing. So yeah, I'm Mike. I've been an Agile coach and a Scrum Master for coming up to about 8 years now. The pattern that I started to notice after doing the job for a while was that there were a lot of repeat steps that I would take when I would join organizations, to how to find issues, how to solve problems, that kind of thing. And as I got further through my career, and I also realized this other problem of there's not a lot of support for Scrum Masters and Agile coaches in terms of how to do the job beyond just learning Scrum or other processes, but how to actually make meaningful change in an organization. I kind of realized I could combine my approach to solve both of those problems, right? So that was kind of where Dysfunction Mapping was born. I kind of put some structure around the steps that I was taking when I joined an organization, and created this like repeatable approach that I could teach to other people. And now that's kind of what I spend a lot of my time doing, is making that accessible and offering that training to people in the hopes that they'll better be able to solve problems.
That was a quick intro. So obviously, yeah, we're going to discuss dysfunction mapping today, and we're also going to have some links that we can share in the chat if you want to access. You also have a Miro template ready. You also have all sorts of articles even written. So we're going to share that. But do you want to walk us through the process that you follow when you conduct a dysfunction mapping exercise?
Yeah, cool. So it starts probably as a lot of people in, when you join a team, when you join an organization, what you're probably used to, which is by observing and by talking to people. And so I even often describe it as being a chance to give yourself permission not to jump straight into solving problems. So I don't know about you guys, but when I would join in a new organization, there's like this immense pressure to just immediately start solving stuff. Sometimes that's pressure that we put on ourselves. Sometimes it comes from elsewhere. And so, yeah, that first sort of couple of weeks is really just about observing. And as part of the workshop, one of the things I offer are some prompt cards and some tools that you can have to kind of guide your observations, basically just so you can start writing down what you see. And the way this always works out for me is I just write down anything and everything that either looks like it's causing people pain, that they're complaining about, or that just triggers like my spidey sense. It's a term I use a lot, right? And I'm sure you kind of know what I mean, is when you've been a coach for a while, there are these things that they trigger that feeling in your head that this doesn't quite seem right. So you just write all that stuff down. And then what you end up with is this thing I call a funnel, which is just a bunch of stuff that you've written down, things that feel bad, look bad, just don't feel right. And the first step of dysfunction mapping, the first kind of structured approach that you take, is deciding whether these things constitute dysfunctions or symptoms. And this, for me, is a way of separating out things that are just bad, right? So an example of that would be Dave and Andrea hate each other. They get into an argument every time they're in the same room. Well, that's bad, but I wouldn't call it a dysfunction. A dysfunction is where we are deliberately or maybe accidentally deviating from some known good practice. So for example, if we're a Scrum team, well, if we deliberately break the rules of Scrum, that would be a dysfunction. If we, don't have a product owner for our team, or our Scrum Master is micromanaging the team, those go against the rules of Scrum, and those count as dysfunctions. And the general goal is to try to find themes and patterns where one dysfunction might solve many of those underlying symptoms. But as I describe in some of the other work that I've done on this, it's about forming a hypothesis. So it's not about knowing what the right answer is. It's just looking at those patterns and saying, I think this dysfunction could be related to these symptoms. And then you go through this process of forming a solution hypothesis, which starts with purpose, which is understanding why those rules exist in the first place. So for example, in Scrum, the Scrum guide says that a Scrum team should have a product owner. Well, I as a coach should understand why that is. Why does Scrum say that there's a product owner in the team, and I'll have to make sure that I understand that before I go trying to solve the problem. And then once you've done that, then you can come up with a solution, which again, I provide sort of prompts and approaches that you can take to forming a solution. And then finally, the kind of important one, I think the bit that a lot of people are missing when they go through these sorts of processes is measure. So it's, how do I know that the thing, the action that I'm taking or whatever I'm doing has the desired outcome? And in dysfunction mapping, you do that by actually looping it back to those symptoms that you discovered in the first place. So one example would be Dave and Andrea hate each other. They get in an argument every time they go in a room. Well, that's a sign of team conflict. Maybe I would be on the lookout for ways I could measure or see those team conflicts to see if the things that I'm doing, lessen that or have an impact. So none of it's a silver bullet. None of it gives you like an exact answer, but it's just about putting structure around those observations and hopefully coming up with some ideas that you can then test in an incremental way to hopefully make things better.
So basically, I just wanted to ask that at some point, do you also involve the team? And if yes, then at what point or at what step? And how does that look?
Yes, it's a good question. So my experience has been varied on this. And as I give it to more and more practitioners, I'm finding the same thing, which is there's not really a right or wrong answer, but it depends a real lot on it's sort of the culture of the organization. So in high psychological safety places, it's a lot easier to involve the team really early on, maybe even throughout, which I've done sometimes, right? So that's actually showing them the patterns you're seeing, getting their feedback and how things might be related, talking about those dysfunctions and why they're causing pain, all the way through to the solutions that you take. In other organizations and in other teams, there's a lot of hesitance to saying that anything isn't perfect, right? I think there's often that feeling that you're not allowed to say that we're not following process, we're breaking rules, or there's a defensiveness. And so sometimes you have to kind of limit the number of people that are involved in that early part of the decision making, or at least rather the theming. And so in those cases, I would say you would limit it to just maybe other Agile coaches and Scrum Masters so that you're not just in a room doing it by yourself, because that's generally not a good idea. But making sure you're getting feedback from other people that sort of can see the patterns in the organization. But even if you don't share the actual forming of the dysfunction map with the rest of the organization, what I always do and what I recommend other people do is once you've gone through the process and you've come up with your solution hypotheses, those are the things that you should then share with the organization and test and get that feedback on. So there's always a chance to make sure that other people are included. It's just a case of kind of how early on you can include their feedback without it potentially derailing the process or the approach that you're trying to take. So yeah, your mileage may vary, I guess.
Yeah, sounds good. Vlad?
Yeah, fair enough.
You're up next.
Thank you. Once you identify these issues, the dysfunctions and the symptoms for anything deeper, how do you prioritize which ones you want to tackle first?
Yeah, that's a hard question, right? I think again, it's changed for me as I've done this in different organizations. So my initial kind of guidance is as you're forming your themes and even as you're gathering your potential symptoms and dysfunctions, you're probably going to start to see things that pop up multiple times. So for example, if 4 different people complain that we have too much work in progress, we never have time to do stuff, or we're always in meetings, those kinds of things, you might combine those into a single item, but give it a higher weighting because more people have complained about it. And so that kind of naturally rises to the top. So that's kind of the easiest way without needing to do any kind of formal prioritization, I guess. But my usual pattern is that gives me my start point. But then once I've started forming my ideas and thinking, okay, here are some actions I'm going to take, I always try and form more than one potential solution for each problem, and then use that as a conversation with product owners or leaders or other people in the organization, and kind of ask them which they think would make the most impact. Because again, there's never really a right or wrong answer. It's just really about getting buy-in, right? Do people actually support us doing these things? So a really easy example would be let's say the product owner feels disempowered, right? Because they're not really able to make decisions. There's some other stakeholder that's telling them what they should build. Well, there are solutions that might involve getting people in a room and doing training. There's potentially one that involves getting into like a one-on-one mentoring relationship with a key stakeholder that's doing that. There might be a solution that involves just asking coaching questions to a person to get them to understand their patterns of behavior. All of those are potential solutions. But if you take it to the product owner who's kind of most impacted, they might say, oh yeah, definitely go for this one. And you can kind of, again, it gives you that flexibility to take it in the direction that the stakeholders maybe would prefer or would make their lives easier.
Nice. Let's look at it from the other perspective then. So what do you think are the most common pitfalls or challenges when trying to use this method? And if you've encountered any, how would you address them?
So the ones that I've fallen into the most are that I guess there's two actually. So number one is that analysis paralysis, when there's just so much and there are so many options that it can be hard to decide where to go. And so that's why I've kind of built into the process now. And when I teach it, something I didn't do before, which is separating out the themes with distinct lines and aiming to at least get one thing. So rather than trying to organize everything, if you can get one thing to start with, then that gives you a kind of a thing to chase. Because again, the way I look at it is there's very rarely going to be right or wrong. Just get an idea, get an approach, and then try it and test it and see if it has the impact that you want it to have. And then as you go, you'll get a better sense of things. And then the second one is that behind closed doors problem, right? I think sometimes, especially us coaches, maybe it's just me, we have a tendency to want to lock ourselves in a room and think really deeply about a problem and then come out when we think we've got the right solution. And sometimes that's okay, right? Sometimes it's okay to just sit and think deeply about it. But it's really, really important to include other people in that approach. And I think when I first started sharing this with people, that was the trap a lot of them fell into. And then the only other thing that comes to mind is when I first started putting structure around this. Like I say, it started just as a thing that I was writing down on a piece of paper and kind of some repeatable steps I started with. As I started sharing it with other people, that kind of key pillar in the process, that purpose step, which is understanding why that rule of, say, Scrum or Kanban or whatever the framework is, why does that rule exist? People were initially wanting to skip over that, or they were wanting to just give a really simple answer and kind of jump to okay, now let's form a solution. And I've realized that I need to really emphasize to people that that's kind of I would say the most important step in this process, because it's about testing our knowledge as practitioners, making sure that we understand the thing that we're talking about before we go trying to change things. Because I think we often do just run down a path of, we should follow this rule because the Scrum Guide says so. And in my experience, that doesn't lead to good change, or it doesn't lead to people, trusting you. So, putting that as a key pillar in the process has really, I think, made it clear and helped people. But not that many people have really put it into practice in the real world yet. I think probably maybe a dozen, maybe approaching 24 now. So I haven't had like a huge amount of direct feedback on how that's gone. That's maybe a sign of good or bad, right? Who knows? But that's why I'm running the workshops, is I just want to get more feedback as more people use it.
No,
nice. This is something that you may not be able to answer right now because it's still in the early stages. But I'm wondering if you ever thought about a regular cadence of when you should perhaps revisit this, or how often should you look at the dysfunction mapping, or even if you're, let's say, out of the team for a while or for good, does the team revisit this like OKRs every a couple of months, every 3 months or something like that? Did you ever envision this somehow?
Yeah, so I definitely teach it and treat it as a tool that should be regularly returned to and looked at. And for me, when I use it, it's on at least a once per sprint basis. So again, this isn't necessarily part of the tool, but it's how I've used it, and it might be helpful to others, which is once you've used the tool and you've kind of come up with your first few sets of ideas, I then tend to turn that into a coaching Kanban. So I reframe them as backlog items that then I can work on in a Kanban style way, limit my work in progress, focus on going after one or two things. The challenge is depending on the problem you're trying to solve, the time frame at which you can get meaningful feedback or have a sense that you're having an impact can change. So again, there's not necessarily a right answer, but I think, as most Agile practitioners would probably agree, you should lean towards trying to get the smallest cycles that you can and finding a way to measure things in a faster kind of loop. But I guess that one of the things I've built into the tool actually to really deliberately try to solve this problem, and it always confuses people when I first introduce it, and anyone who's looked at my template might know this, is you start from the right hand side of the page and then you work the way to the left. And a lot of people, it's really counterintuitive, right? Well, why wouldn't you start on the left and work to the right? And for me, the reason is to solve exactly the problem you're describing, which is not to treat it as a one and done tool where we're just building the idea, we're coming up with a hypothesis. That's just the first stage. Now you should be constantly looking at it and reflecting upon it and seeing if things are changing the way that you expect. And so by starting from the left with measure, which is the final step of building it, that kind of reframes the way you look at it, and it puts the emphasis on the outcome rather than that first set of symptoms that you've devised. I don't know if that's necessarily been helping people that much, but it's my little attempt to kind of flip it on its head and force people to see it as a tool that's not about just the thing that you build, but that ongoing sort of vision of the things you're trying to change.
All right. I'm sorry, I keep asking questions. They may not be super coherent. Like, we're not just following a narrative, but there's all sorts of stuff that pop into my mind. And I promise, Vlad, I'll let you have the next one. So, because I know you're doing workshops now, and a lot more people are aware of dysfunction mapping, and it's going to get bigger and bigger. I'm wondering if, for anyone listening, should there be, or do you have any prerequisites? Can pretty much anyone learn it? Should you be an agile coach? Should you have a certain number of years of experience? Or I don't know. Are there any prerequisites?
So the more that I'm using it, the more I'm thinking that no, there probably isn't. As in, there's not. You could basically start from nothing, and the tool might help you with solving problems. So there's a couple of, I guess, reasons why I've started where I've started, which is number one, I'm an agile coach, Scrum Master. It was a tool that I sort of created to solve the things that I was trying to solve, right? So that's very much where it's been aimed. And in particular, when I do the workshops, I tend to recommend that you should have at least a sort of a low-level understanding of Scrum, because that's kind of the most common agile framework. It's not that it's required for the tool, it's just it allows me to make sure that when I'm teaching it, that we have some shared language and some, some rules that we can talk about that we're all going to understand. But one of the people who was in my workshop recently, a guy called Manoj, he's a great guy who used to be a teacher, and he's currently transitioning, in the process of transitioning to becoming a Scrum Master. And when we talked about it after the workshop, one of the things he said is this would actually be a really great tool for teachers to do the same thing in understanding the teaching plans and how the content is landing, and how their education program is running. And other people have suggested similar things to me. So I think as a concept, you can actually apply it almost anywhere. The problem is I'm not an expert in all those other things, right? I'm only an expert in this kind of agile thing. So that's where I'm kind of mostly talking about it. But I would love to hear from people that have tried it elsewhere. The most interesting part, right, is that idea of, well, what is a dysfunction? Because in an agile world, I can speak fairly confidently about what dysfunction is, because if you say you're a Scrum team, but you're breaking the rules of Scrum, okay, that's probably dysfunctional. If you are not creating psychological safety, or you're not following XP practices, ignoring TDD, these are things that we can fairly confidently say could, if not definitely, represent dysfunction. Whereas in these other contexts, well, you need to bring your knowledge, right? What is it that is a dysfunction in your domain? But that's one of the reasons why the tool is very agnostic to even which agile approaches or tools you bring in, right? So I talk about Scrum a lot because it's common and because I know it well, but you can use scaled agile frameworks. You could use, Kanban, or like say XP or DevOps. So all sorts of other things you could bring in. So yeah, realistically, I think you could push that out into all sorts of other contexts. But yeah, I'm just not sure I can help so much with those conversations.
Oh, great. Yeah. Well, you kind of answered this question already, but you say that you can use it in pretty much anywhere, including teaching. But does it, in your experience, does it work a little bit better in certain regards? Like I know Andre asked about prerequisites, but it's probably mindset or something along those lines. Did you find it a little bit more useful or easier to go in with Kanban versus Scrum, specifically in the IT industry, or is it really, or are you trying to make it as universal as possible?
So I'm trying to make it somewhat universal. So I guess the way I look at it is, and again, this is just kind of the bias of my experience, is I don't fundamentally believe in like best practice. I don't believe in this idea of there's like a good or a right way of doing things. I shouldn't have said good. There's not a right way of doing things. There are good ways of doing things, right? And there are maybe less good ways of doing things. but the purpose of the tool is really just to support you as a practitioner and the things that you can bring to it. And so I would say that the tool is more useful the more of that knowledge you have to draw upon. So for example, I find now, right after many years of doing this, that it's very, very easy for me to go into an organization and quite quickly come up with some really good patterns and some meaningful steps, because I can draw from Scrum and Safe and Kanban and DevOps and XP, right? And I've got all these things that I can look at and draw from. Whereas if you're a newer practitioner and you only have maybe an entry-level Scrum certification, you don't know much of those other things, well, then you've got less to draw from. I still think it's useful, but you can still go through the same process. But I don't think fundamentally it matters which of those things you draw from. So like one example that always lands me in hot water is I don't particularly have a problem with SAFe, right? Scaled Agile Framework. Some people hate it. I'm as agnostic towards it as most things. I think that it's a tool among others. But one thing that's interesting where I've used dysfunction mapping in that context is, well, if you're in an organization that says that they want to be using Safe, but then they're deliberately breaking a bunch of the rules of Safe and getting all these negative outcomes, well, there's still potentially some value to be had from helping people understand those rules and why they exist. So again, it's not about making judgments about which things are right or wrong. It's just giving you that lens that you can say, hey, this stuff over here that you're doing is actually dysfunctional. And one of the kinds of language I use a lot is it's leveraging the intelligence, the collective intelligence of the whole Agile community, right? It's not about saying you should listen to me because I know better. It's about saying, well, you say you want to follow this framework that all these other smart people contributed to, so you should actually follow it, right? And it allows you to kind of use the rule book without using the rule book, if you know what I mean. Because again, I'm not a fan of saying you should follow the rules for the sake of it. But once you've gone through that process and you've understood the purpose of the rule, well, now you can help to articulate that to someone and hopefully get them on board with the change. Sorry, there's a long answer, but hopefully that kind of covered it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And how did it evolve since you created it? Because it got to quite an advanced, I guess, formulation, or I guess in an advanced form. And how do you see it evolving in the future?
Yeah, so like I say, it started with just me with like my iPad and my Apple Pencil, right? And I would take all my notes, and I can still remember the kind of first time where it clicked to me that I was doing something very similar to a previous engagement. So I was in this job, I was writing my stuff down, I started circling things and moving them around and connecting them with lines. And it occurred to me that this was like an approach almost. And so I kind of didn't think much of it at the time. But then when I went into my next organization, I tried to do the same thing again, and this time put a bit more structure and give the things headings. And it ended up in a very similar format to what we currently have, essentially. The one thing that was missing was that purpose column, which, like I say, originally it was because I knew internally that was an important step and it was a thing that I was doing. But I realized as soon as I started sharing it with people that they would not necessarily do that, right? I don't think most coaches and Scrum Masters, especially when they're new in their journey, realize or appreciate the importance of understanding purpose and helping other people to understand purpose, right? It's not just about the rules, it's about why those rules are there. And then once that was in place, the general building blocks were there. So then it just became about, okay, well, how do I, make the language simple and easy to understand? How do I put some structure around what each of these steps means, right? Because the obvious one is that solution column, right? So we've come up with our symptoms and our dysfunctions, we've decided our purpose. Now we need a solution. Well, at first it was just like, oh, well, I've got my 8 years of experience to draw from. Easy, right? I just come up with a solution. But when you're giving it to a new practitioner who maybe doesn't have that experience to draw from, you need to give them more than just, hey, come up with a solution. So that was where I started putting in some kind of guidance steps. And so for those who've been to the workshop or seen the videos, you might know that I talk about the 6 stances of a Scrum Master quite a lot. Again, not because I particularly think it matters if you're using Scrum. I don't think that's necessary. But the 6 stances, Barry Overeem's stuff that he created, is just massively useful for almost anyone in a somewhat coaching role. And doing things like looking at the problem and saying, could I act as a coach? Could I act as a mentor? Could I act as an impediment remover? It gives you some of that structure to come up with your hypotheses. And then, yeah, like I say, it's landed in the format that I've now been sharing for sort of nearly 6 months now, maybe. It's flying by. And where it goes from here is really hard to say, because I'm now trying to straddle that line of, I'm getting quite a lot of feedback, but a lot of it is quite small, as in, and I'm not sure whether it's right or wrong. So the way I'm generally kind of talking about it now is I'm probably not going to make a change to the core sort of tool based just on someone's idea of what might be better. What I want is for people to take it away and use it and change it themselves, because this isn't like a Scrum framework, right? It's not immutable. You can change it in whatever way you think is useful. If you want to change the headings, if you want to move things around, do things in a different order, go for it, right? I'd love to hear how that goes. And if I start hearing patterns that lots of people are changing things in similar ways, or they're struggling with similar areas, that's where I'll probably start making changes to the core content. But that's kind of where I'm trying to hold the line at the moment, and we'll see. I don't know necessarily how that's going to play out.
So you just basically answered my next question, because I was about to ask, like, I've been to one of your workshops, the short ones, the 1 hour workshop, I think. And I even had so many thoughts at the end. And what I liked about it is that towards the end, people were just sharing opinions, were just sharing improvements. You even had someone suggesting perhaps different titles, rather than calling it solutions. You may call it opportunities, or you may call it something else, or experiments. I think it was at the time. I actually thought about, can you have lagging or leading measures? Because some of the impact may be quicker to spot, some of the impact may be longer to spot, and maybe you want to point that out. And yeah, indeed. So I think the emphasis, which I want to state again, is that perhaps people will end up kind of changing it and adapting it to their expertise, to their needs, to their combination of other tools, which now actually leads me to another question. I'm thinking, does this complement any other agile tools or any other agile techniques? If so, if yes, then are you aware of any?
So, I mean, there's a couple of things that I guess were in my mind when I kind of created the approach, right? When I tried to standardize it, and there's 2 that I'm really big fan of. So one of those probably everyone knows, which is user story mapping. As an approach, I just find it really, really helpful as a, how do you illuminate what we're trying to build and what the most valuable things are. That was part of what informed the idea of mapping it out. And then another mapping tool that I really like is impact mapping, which is maybe a few people might be, fewer people will be familiar with, but it's still not uncommon. And that's more about how you go through a process of finding out what we're going to build and who we intend to impact. And so I've kind of taken little bits of both of those in my approach. And I think both of those are often, for me, things that I will do as a result of some of the things that come out of a dysfunction map. And so again, this comes down to that question of, what tools can you draw upon as a practitioner to solve those problems? Another one, I think I just love mapping, because value stream mapping is another one that I'm like a really big fan of. And again, it's one of those things, right? It's like the tool is not going to give you any answers. It's not going to lead you to some magical new knowledge that you didn't have before. What it does is help you organize your thoughts, come up with an idea, and test it based on those observations. And so the more of these things you can draw from it, right? Because if, for example, one of the challenges is we've got massive wait times because of handoffs between teams, and everyone's complaining that it takes ages to get a build out, or whatever the problem is. Those are things that me as a practitioner would look at and say, maybe a value stream mapping exercise would help to create some transparency, right? Because that's one of those lenses that I bring in the solution hypothesis, is how can you create an inspection opportunity, an adaptation opportunity? How can you increase transparency? And so again, just having those tools to draw upon just gives you more ways to flex it. But I don't think there are any particular tools that you must have, or that are good or bad to go with it. Again, this is I talk about it like leveling up your agile coaching practice, right? It's just about giving you a little bit extra structure, because especially those of us who've been doing this for years, we've probably got a lot of patterns built up. But I think for newer Scrum Masters, newer agile coaches, it can be really hard to know where to start. And so I'm all about saying, well, I don't necessarily know either, but here's some structure that you can use to try and come up with some ideas, and then see how that goes. For me, again, just the patterns that I've seen, I'm not saying this applies to everyone, but I think the trap that we often fall into is we think that because we can be personally productive when we're at home, that it's therefore the same. But I think one of the things the Agile movement has been all about is teaching us that actually personal productivity is one of the least important factors in effective teams, right? A team in which everyone collaborates and where we get really good feedback loops, but everyone is only utilized to 30% is going to be much better than the team where everyone's utilized to 100%, but never has time to talk to each other.